The moment my mother said, "Your sister will be staying at your house for a while," I realized something important. They weren't asking. They never had. I was standing barefoot on polished concrete floors, staring out at an ocean I worked half my life to afford. The house wasn't just a house, it was proof. Proof that quiet people can build loud success. Proof that discipline beats favoritism. Proof that I survived them. And yet, there they were, claiming it like it had always been theirs. "You don't need all that space anyway," my father added, voice calm, rehearsed. "Family shares. Family shares." Funny how sharing always moved in one direction. For 36 years, I'd been what they called low maintenance. The child who didn't cry, didn't ask, didn't break. The one who learned early that attention was a limited resource, and my sister had a lifetime subscription. When I got good grades, they said, "That's expected." When she barely passed, they celebrated. When I paid my own tuition, they called me independent. When she needed money, for school, weddings, businesses, mistakes, they called me selfish if I hesitated. So when they told me her family would be moving into my home within the week, I didn't scream. I didn't argue, I said, "Okay." They heard weakness. What they didn't hear was resolve, because they didn't know what I knew. They didn't know I'd spent years structuring my life so they could never touch it. They didn't know the house wasn't legally mine, at least not in the way they understood ownership. And they certainly didn't know what I'd started uncovering the moment my father's voice carried that subtle threat. "Don't make this difficult." Difficult for whom? That night, as waves broke rhythmically against the shore, I sat alone in the dark and asked myself a question I'd avoided my entire life. Why am I still protecting people who never protected me? I thought about my grandparents, the only ones who ever looked at me like I mattered. About the way everything changed after they died. About how love in my family had always come with conditions. And for the first time, I didn't feel sad. I felt alert. Because when people who have underestimated you for decades suddenly get bold, it's usually because they think you're powerless. They were wrong, and the next 7 days would prove it. Stay with me, because the reason they wanted my house wasn't generosity, it was desperation. And what they were hiding would change everything. They arrived on Tuesday morning with a moving truck that was far too large for a temporary stay. I watched from the balcony as my sister, Elena, stepped out of her SUV like she was arriving at a resort, oversized sunglasses, confident smile, the unmistakable posture of someone who expects doors to open without knocking. Her husband followed, barking instructions to movers who already seemed to know where everything belonged. That's when the first crack appeared. They weren't asking where to put things, they were directing. Boxes labeled primary bedroom, office files, kitchen storage disappeared into my house like they'd rehearsed it. I stood frozen in the doorway, the sound of my own heartbeat louder than the surf behind me. "How do you know the layout?" I asked, forcing my voice steady. Elena waved a hand. "Mom showed us pictures, family stuff, family stuff." By nightfall, my home no longer felt like mine. Her kids had claimed rooms. Her husband set up a workstation in the space I used to meditate. My parents took the guest suite and immediately began rearranging furniture. No one asked permission. No one acknowledged the invasion. That night, sleep refused to come. Something felt wrong, not emotionally wrong, but strategically wrong. This wasn't entitlement alone. It was urgency. So I started paying attention. I noticed how often Alina whispered on the phone and went quiet when I entered the room. I noticed how my father hovered near my office door, eyes scanning my shelves. I noticed how my mother kept asking oddly specific questions about paperwork, insurance, and just-in-case scenarios. And then came the sentence that changed everything. "You've always trusted us," my father said casually over breakfast. "That's why all this works so smoothly." Works, not worked, not will work, present tense. That afternoon, I drove to the bank where my grandparents had once held their accounts. I didn't know what I was looking for, just that the threat in my father's voice days earlier hadn't been empty. It took persistence, identification checks, and an hour of quiet waiting. But when the clerk returned with documents older than my career, my stomach dropped. There it was, a trust, my name listed first, and an amount that made my hands shake on the steering wheel when I got back to my car. Money I'd never received. Money that vanished the same year my sister's dream venture launched and failed. That was the moment I understood. The house wasn't the prize. I was, my credit, my name, my silence. And suddenly, every strange behavior snapped into focus. They weren't moving in because they wanted space. They were moving in because they were running out of time. I sat in the driver's seat long after the sun dipped below the horizon, documents spread across my lap, knowing one thing with terrifying clarity. If I didn't act first, they would bury me under debts I never agreed to. And they were counting on the same thing they always had, that I'd stay quiet. But silence only protects predators. Once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. I went back to the house that night and smiled through dinner like nothing had changed. I listened while Alina complained about stress, while my mother sighed about sacrifices, while my father drank his wine and spoke with the calm confidence of a man who believed the endgame was already decided. Inside, I was counting moves. The next morning, I took a day off work for the first time in years, not to rest, but to hunt. If they were bold enough to move into my home without permission, they had already crossed legal lines. People like that always leave fingerprints. I started with my credit report. The first page looked normal. The second didn't. There it was, a business loan from years earlier, my name listed as a co-guarantor. A six-figure amount. Active, my signature attached. I stared at it, waiting for panic. Instead, something colder settled in, because I had never signed that document, never even seen it. I called a forensic document examiner before lunch. By dinner, she confirmed what my instincts already knew. The signature was a near-perfect imitation, close enough to pass automated systems, sloppy enough to fall apart under scrutiny. That's when I stopped feeling afraid. I pulled every financial record I could access. Old tax filings, archived emails, business registrations tied to my sister's failed ventures, and slowly, a pattern emerged, each collapse cushioned by money that never quite had a clear source. Money that should have been mine. Then came the most dangerous discovery. A pending loan application submitted less than 2 weeks earlier, larger than the others. My name listed as sole guarantor. My home address referenced as proof of residency. Collateral. They weren't just stealing from me, they were positioning me to absorb their downfall. I sat in my locked office while the house buzzed with borrowed life below me. Laughter, footsteps, confidence. They believed they were untouchable because they believed I was predictable. That night, the vents carried sound too clearly. "She won't fight," my father said. "She never does." Elena laughed softly. "And even if she tries, we have paperwork. She's on everything." That was the moment the final switch flipped. This wasn't favoritism anymore. This wasn't manipulation. This was premeditated. I didn't confront them. I didn't cry. I didn't threaten. I documented. Every conversation after that was recorded. Every document copied. Every timeline reconstructed. I hired a financial fraud attorney who didn't flinch when I laid everything out. Her first words to me were simple. "They built this assuming you'd stay small." She paused, then added, "That's their mistake." Because here's what my family never understood. Being quiet doesn't mean being powerless. It means you're watching. Once I understood the scale of what they'd done, I stopped reacting and started designing. People assume justice begins with confrontation. They're wrong. Justice begins with patience, with letting the other side believe they're winning. So I played my role. I smiled at breakfast. I nodded during their planning conversations. I let my mother complain about how hard this transition was for everyone. I even laughed when Alina joked that the house finally felt lived in. Inside, I was building a case so airtight it wouldn't need raised voices. My attorney helped me map everything on a timeline, every forged document, every transfer, every lie stacked neatly on top of the last. When you line up 20 years of small misunderstandings, they stop looking small, they look like intent. Then came the most important decision. Exposure, not the reckless kind, not the emotional kind, the kind that leaves no room to twist the story. I happened to sit on the advisory board of a local nonprofit, one focused on coastal preservation and ethical land ownership. Hosting community events was normal. Expected even, so I scheduled one at the house. I told my family it was networking. They loved that. Elena immediately offered to help host. My parents were thrilled. To them, it was the perfect stage to reinforce the image they'd spent decades crafting. Generous, supportive, close-knit. They never asked what the agenda was. Invitations went out quietly to neighbors, board members, local professionals. and to two people my family didn't recognize as threats: a financial crimes investigator I'd once met through work, and a retired estate attorney who'd handled cases eerily similar to mine. The week before the event, my sister's confidence grew. I could see it in the way she walked through the house, in how openly she discussed future plans, renovations, refinancing, longer-term arrangements. They thought the house was already theirs. The night before the gathering, my father pulled me aside. His tone was almost gentle. "You're doing the right thing," he said, "keeping this in the family." I looked at him and realized something chilling. He truly believed that family meant immunity. That belief would be his undoing. By the time guests arrived the next evening, my evidence was organized, authenticated, and duplicated. Recordings backed up in 3 places. Documents reviewed by experts. Every claim supported. All that remained was timing. As laughter filled the living room and wine glasses clinked, I stood near the window and watched my family perform warmth for an audience. They were relaxed, comfortable, certain. They didn't know this wasn't a celebration. It was a reckoning. And when I finally stepped forward to speak, no one, not even me, was prepared for how completely the truth would dismantle everything they thought they controlled. I waited until the room was full. 30 people stood in my living room: neighbors, board members, local professionals, laughing softly, balancing wine glasses, admiring the ocean view. My family moved among them like seasoned performers. Alina radiant, my parents gracious, the picture of unity. I cleared my throat. "I just want to thank everyone for coming," I began, stepping toward the screen set up near the fireplace. "Tonight isn't just about community or property values. It's about trust." My sister smiled, nodding along. My father folded his arms, proud. I clicked the remote. The first slide appeared, the legal deed to the house. "This property," I said calmly, "is owned solely by an LLC under my control. No co-owners, no shared rights." A flicker of confusion crossed my mother's face. Click. The next slide showed side-by-side signatures, mine and the forged versions. "These are loan documents filed using my name," I continued. "I didn't sign them. A forensic analyst confirmed they were fabricated." The air shifted. Conversations stopped. My father stepped forward. "Victoria, this is inappropriate. Please," my attorney said from the back of the room, her voice steady. "She has the floor." Click. The trust document appeared next, highlighted, annotated. "My grandparents left a trust," I said, my voice unwavering. 70% was meant for me. I never received it. The funds were withdrawn years ago by the executors, my parents. Alina's smile collapsed. My mother shook her head desperately. "This isn't how it happened." I pressed play. The room filled with sound, my father's voice, recorded clearly through the vents weeks earlier. "She won't fight. She never does." Then Alina's laugh. "And even if she tries, we have paperwork." Silence followed, heavy, absolute. That's when the door opened. An elderly woman entered slowly, leaning on a cane, eyes sharp despite her age. My father's face drained of color. "No," he whispered. "Yes," she replied gently. She handed me a letter, yellowed paper, familiar handwriting, my grandmother's words. I read them aloud. Every line. Every warning she'd left behind in case I was ever betrayed by the people meant to protect me. The investigator stepped forward next, introducing herself formally, explaining the implications of forged financial instruments and pending loan applications. No one interrupted her. No one could. My family didn't collapse dramatically. There were no screams, just quiet unraveling. Alina gathered her children and backed toward the door. My parents stood frozen, exposed not by emotion, but by evidence. I looked at them and felt something unexpected. Not triumph, relief, because the truth no longer belonged to me alone. Justice didn't crash into my family's life with sirens or handcuffs. It arrived quietly, methodically. And once it did, nothing could stop it. Within 48 hours of the gathering, the pending loan tied to my name was frozen and flagged. Banks don't like uncertainty, and they hate fraud. Accounts my sister relied on suddenly went dark. Creditors who had been patient for years began calling again, this time with sharper questions and shorter deadlines. My parents were interviewed first, not arrested, not accused in public, just documented, every statement recorded, every inconsistency noted. When people lie for decades, they forget which version they told to whom. Investigators don't. Alina lost her leverage next. Her employer didn't fire her outright. They placed her on indefinite review. In professional language, that meant trust was gone. Within 2 weeks, she resigned quietly. No announcement, no farewell post. Her husband lasted longer. He tried to negotiate with me. He asked if I'd consider helping stabilize things for the sake of the children. I told him the same thing I'd learned too late in life. Rescuing people from consequences only teaches them they'll never have any. A week later, he moved out. The house he and Alina owned went into foreclosure proceedings soon after. Creditors don't wait when the illusion of security disappears. My parents' social circle unraveled next. People they'd known for decades stopped calling. Invitations slowed, then stopped entirely. Not because of gossip, but because facts had been witnessed, documented, verified. The image they'd protected so carefully collapsed under the weight of truth. Through all of it, I stayed silent publicly. No interviews, no statements, no defending myself. I didn't need to. I filed a civil claim instead. My attorney calculated the original trust value plus interest, 20 years' worth. The number was staggering, more than I ever imagined receiving. But by then, it wasn't about money. It was about acknowledgement. They tried to settle privately, asked for time, asked for forgiveness wrapped in familiar language. I offered one option: structured repayment, full transparency, and no interference with my life ever again. They accepted. Not because they were sorry, because they were cornered. When my parents lost access to credit entirely, they called me one last time. My mother cried. My father spoke about health and age and family bonds. I listened. And then I said, once the noise stopped, the quiet felt unfamiliar. For weeks after everything settled, I moved through my days like someone relearning gravity. No emergency calls, no guilt-laced messages, no subtle reminders of what I owed. The absence of chaos should have felt like relief, but instead, it exposed something deeper. Grief. Not for the family I lost, but for the version of myself I'd sacrificed to keep them comfortable. I started therapy at my attorney's suggestion. I told myself it was practical, closure, stress management, all the reasonable excuses high-functioning people use to avoid emotional truth. But in the first session, the therapist asked a question that unraveled me. When did you learn that your needs were dangerous? I didn't answer right away. Images surfaced instead, being praised for not crying, being called easy because I didn't ask for help, being rewarded with approval only when I stayed small. I had confused endurance with virtue, silence with maturity. I realized something painful. My family didn't steal my voice. I handed it to them, piece by piece, because I believed love had to be earned through erasure. That understanding hurt more than any financial betrayal. Around the same time, I received a letter from a law firm I didn't recognize. My chest tightened as I opened it, bracing for another battle. But inside was something unexpected. A second provision of my grandparents' trust. Money set aside, not for education or investment, but for my well-being. Activated only if I ever pursued legal action to protect myself. My grandmother had known. She'd known I might need proof someday, not just for court, but for myself. Proof that standing up didn't make me cruel. That choosing myself wasn't a failure of loyalty. I cried harder over that letter than I had over anything else. I didn't keep the money. Instead, I used it to start something new, a small initiative offering legal guidance to people facing financial exploitation within families. Quiet help, no spotlight, just resources where shame used to live. Helping others untangle their fear did something unexpected for me. It softened the self-blame. I began to forgive the younger version of myself, the one who stayed silent because she didn't know another way to survive. I stopped calling her weak. I started calling her brave, because endurance kept me alive. Boundaries set me free. One evening, months later, I found an old photo while unpacking storage boxes. Me at 8 years old, standing between my grandparents in their garden. I framed it and placed it where I could see it every day, not as a reminder of what I lost, but of what I reclaimed. And just when I thought the story was finally ending, a message arrived that proved this wasn't just my transformation. It was the beginning of something larger. 6 months after everything fell apart, my life looked nothing like it used to. The house was quiet in a good way. Not the tense silence of unspoken resentment, but the calm that comes when nothing is waiting to explode. Mornings belong to me, coffee on the deck, ocean air, no obligations disguised as love. The legal settlement payments arrived on schedule. I barely noticed them anymore. What I did notice were the emails. Messages from people I'd never met, women, mostly, who found their way to the small foundation I'd created. Stories poured in about parents who drained college funds, siblings who forged signatures, families who weaponized guilt to keep control. Different details. Same pattern. One message stopped me cold. A woman in her 40s wrote, "I thought I was imagining things. Everyone told me I was ungrateful. Then I read your story, and for the first time I realized I wasn't crazy." I read it 3 times. That was the moment I understood something my grandmother had known all along. Visibility is contagious. When one invisible person steps into the light, others recognize the way out. I was invited to speak at a community center about financial boundaries. I almost declined. Old instincts flared: don't take up space, don't make people uncomfortable, don't be that woman. Then I went anyway. The room was full. Not with curiosity, but recognition. Faces that mirrored years of quiet endurance. I told my story without drama, without anger, just truth. I watched shoulders relax, eyes fill, heads nod. Afterward, people lined up to talk. Some whispered, some cried, some just said thank you. I realized I'd spent most of my life believing my role was to absorb impact so others didn't have to. I was wrong. My role was to survive and then speak. I haven't heard from my parents since the settlement began. My sister sent one message months ago: "I hope you're happy." I didn't reply. Because happiness isn't something you explain to people who benefited from your silence. It's something you protect. I still live in the same house. I still work hard. But I no longer confuse peace with compliance. I no longer measure my worth by how useful I am to others. Sometimes I sit on the porch at sunset and think about that girl in the photo, the one who didn't know yet that she'd be overlooked, underestimated, and exploited. I wish I could tell her this. One day, you'll stop disappearing. One day, you'll choose yourself without apology. And when you do, everything changes. If this story felt familiar, if you've ever been the reliable one, the quiet one, the invisible one, know this: you are not difficult for wanting fairness. You are not selfish for setting boundaries. And you are not wrong for choosing peace over permission. The invisible daughter doesn't vanish forever. She rises. And once she does, no one can take that away from her again.